My knuckles turned white as I gripped the kitchen counter, the cool marble doing nothing to soothe the heat rising inside me. I could hear the delicate clink of Jillian's spoon against porcelain as she stirred her tea behind me, the anniversary edition bone china I'd given her for our 15th. Each tap echoed like a miniature thunderclap in the silence between us. "By the way," she said, her voice casual as if commenting on a change in weather, "Camille's wedding in 3 weeks will be family only." I stood frozen, not trusting myself to turn around. Through the window, I could see our neighbor mowing his lawn, his world still spinning normally while mine had just tilted on its axis. "Susan, that's Bryce's mother, thinks it would be less awkward if you didn't attend." Less awkward. The words sliced through me as memories flashed. Camille's tiny fingers wrapped around mine the first time I held her in the hospital. Her wide-eyed trust when I taught her to ride that bicycle I'd assembled from scratch. Her fevered brow as I sang the same lullaby for the 100th time to help her sleep. Less awkward for whom? I finally managed, my voice strained. The air seemed to be slowly vacuumed from the room, making it hard to breathe. Jillian remained silent, creating a small whirlpool in her tea, a perfect metaphor for the chaos now swirling in my heart. I turned to look at her, this woman I'd shared a bed with for over 20 years, and found her staring through me as if I were already a ghost. "I'm her father," I said, my voice breaking on the word father, as if I were trying to convince myself as much as her. Jillian sighed and took a deliberate sip of tea, leaving a crescent of lipstick on the rim. "You're overreacting, Michael. It's just a wedding." "Just a wedding?" "My daughter's wedding." The words hit me like a physical blow. I bandaged her knees when she fell off that first bike. I sat beside her bed during that awful fever in 4th grade, singing that stupid song over and over. I took a second job when the company cut my pay so she could keep taking ballet lessons. I was saving that old Ford to give to her. "You're being dramatic," Jillian interrupted, her eyes finally meeting mine but with a coldness I barely recognized. "This is what Camille wants. Susan has already taken over all the wedding details, and Camille is afraid of conflict between you two." My gaze drifted to the refrigerator where a photo of Camille at her graduation was held by a magnet. Her smile bright, her future stretching before her. I'd been the only one standing and applauding when they called her name. "Camille said she'd be more comfortable this way," Jillian continued, placing her cup down with a decisive click. I walked out of the kitchen without another word, feeling hollow, as if something vital had been scooped out of me. In the living room, my dusty laptop sat on the desk. I rarely use social media, rarely connected to the world outside our increasingly silent home. My fingers trembled as I opened a travel site, the cursor hovering over destinations I'd never considered visiting. Santorini caught my eye, that blue-domed paradise my late father had described with such longing. He dreamed of going but never made it. With a recklessness I hadn't felt in years, I booked everything: the flight, a cliffside villa, even guided tours. The confirmation emails flooded my inbox while Jillian's laughter filtered in from the kitchen. She was on the phone, probably discussing wedding details I'd never be consulted on. "No, I didn't tell him it was your idea, Camille," her voice drifted through the doorway. "He wouldn't understand." The words froze me mid-click. My own daughter had suggested I be excluded. A strange calm settled over me as I finalized the booking for a 2-week stay. I'd be back just days before the wedding, a wedding I was no longer welcome to attend. Sometimes people need to notice your absence to remember your presence. And after 20 years of fading into the background of my own life, it was time they noticed I was gone. I woke before my alarm the next morning, a strange lightness in my chest despite the heaviness of yesterday's revelations. Sunlight filtered through the blinds, casting prison bar shadows across our bedroom floor. Jillian's side of the bed was already empty, the sheets cold. She'd probably gone for her morning run, plotting wedding details with Susan through her earbuds. My old leather travel bag, a wedding gift from my father, waited in the closet, untouched for years. I ran my fingers over the worn surface, remembering his words, "for adventures yet to come." He couldn't have known those adventures would take 20 years to arrive. I packed with deliberate minimalism. A few shirts that had seen a decade of wear but were comfortable like old friends. Frayed shorts Jillian had tried to throw away countless times. Sandals from our Florida trip when Camille was 14 and still wanted to build sandcastles with me. A photograph of the three of us from when everything still felt genuine, Camille missing her front teeth, Jillian's smile reaching her eyes, my arm protectively around them both. In my desk drawer I found an old notebook, its pages yellowed at the edges. I tore out a sheet, the sound surprisingly loud in the quiet house. My hand hovered over the paper for a moment before I wrote, "Gone to Santorini for 2 weeks. We'll be back a few days before Camille's wedding. Don't call unless it's an emergency. Michael. Just Michael, not Dad, not your loving husband, not any of the roles I'd played faithfully for decades only to be written out of the final act. I left the note on the kitchen table, the same spot where Jillian had casually shattered my world with her teacup and indifference. The morning light caught on something shiny by the front door, Camille's wedding invitation, its gold-embossed lettering gleaming mockingly. I picked it up, running my thumb over the raised text that had cost a small fortune, part of which had come from my bonus. To celebrate the union of Camille Elizabeth Taylor and Bryce William Montgomery. I laughed bitterly. Celebrate without the father of the bride, apparently. In my car, I turned the radio to full volume, drowning my thoughts in someone else's music. Freedom blared through the speakers as I pulled away from the house I'd spent 20 years turning into a home. The drive to the airport took me past landmarks of a life now feeling increasingly foreign. Camille's elementary school where I'd attended every play, every recital, my camera always ready. The hospital where she was born, where I'd shed tears of joy and terror in equal measure. The cafe where Jillian had said yes many years ago, her eyes full of promises we both believed in then. At the airport bookstore, I bought a copy of Starting Over After 50, a title that made me smile grimly at its appropriateness. I tucked it into my bag without reading the back cover. I was already living the synopsis. On the plane, I chose a window seat, something Jillian always hated. When the flight attendant offered drinks, I declined alcohol for the first time in longer than I cared to admit. Vacation or escape? The attendant asked with practiced cheerfulness as she handed me a water instead. I looked up, surprised by her perceptiveness. Her name tag read Elena, and something in her eyes suggested she'd seen many men like me before, fleeing toward or away from something. Maybe both, I replied, finding myself offering a genuine smile for the first time in days. As the plane climbed above the clouds, I scrolled through my phone messages. Nothing from Jillian yet. Nothing from Camille. A text from my colleague David, budget meeting pushed to Thursday. Bring your A game. How strange that life continued in its mundane patterns while I was breaking decades of habit, thousands of feet above the earth and climbing higher still. I turned my phone to airplane mode, then thought better of it and sent a single message to our family group chat, which had been silent for weeks except for wedding logistics. Landed safely in Santorini. We'll be back a few days before the wedding. Then I turned the phone off completely and closed my eyes. The drone of the engines created a peaceful white noise, drowning out the echo of Jillian's words. Less awkward, overreacting, dramatic. Perhaps I was being dramatic. Perhaps this spontaneous journey was nothing but a middle-aged tantrum. But as the distance between me and my former life increased with each passing mile, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, the sensation of oxygen filling lungs that had been slowly suffocating. Somewhere over the Atlantic, I realized I wasn't running away. I was finally running toward something, even if that something was just the possibility of remembering who Michael Taylor was before he became invisible in his own home. The moon hung over Santorini like a silver coin as my taxi wound its way along cliff-edge roads. After the endless drone of airplane engines, the night silence felt almost sacred, broken only by the occasional bleating of a distant goat and my driver's animated commentary. My name is Costas, he announced, his accent thick but English clear. 30 years driving this island. I know every stone, every secret. He glanced at me in the rearview mirror, his weathered face creasing into a smile. You know this island was once Atlantis? Many believe it sank beneath these waters thousands of years ago. I watched the moonlight shimmer across the dark sea below us, trying to imagine an entire civilization swallowed by those depths. The island is actually the edge of a volcano, Costas continued, taking a sharp turn that made my stomach lurch. Beautiful, yes? Born from fire, shaped by destruction. He laughed, the sound echoing in the small car. People come here for two reasons only, to fall in love or to forget love. Which one are you, American? The question caught me off guard. I'd spent the entire flight avoiding precisely this kind of introspection. I'm the person who was forgotten, I answered, surprising myself with the honesty. Costas nodded solemnly as if I'd confirmed something he already knew. Then Santorini will remember you. The island never forgets. We pulled up to a small whitewashed gate with an elegant sign reading Villa Aphrodite. The irony wasn't lost on me, the goddess of love welcoming a man with a freshly broken heart. A woman in her 40s with olive skin and a ready smile waited at the entrance. Mr. Taylor? Welcome to Villa Aphrodite. I am Eleni, the manager. She handed me a glass of champagne. You look like you need this. I accepted it gratefully, following her through a maze of whitewashed corridors that opened suddenly into a breathtaking space. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed the caldera, a massive volcanic crater filled with midnight blue water that seemed to merge with the star-studded sky. Your private terrace. Eleni gestured to an infinity pool that appeared to spill directly into the sea hundreds of feet below. Breakfast is served whenever you wake. No schedules here. After she left, I stepped onto the terrace, the cool night air raising goosebumps on my arms. The stars here were different, brighter, more numerous than what I could see through the light pollution back home. I tried to remember the last time I'd actually looked at stars. 6 months ago, Camille had asked me to help choose the wedding orchestra. We'd scheduled an afternoon to listen to recordings together. The night before, she texted to cancel. Bryce and his mom already decided. Sorry to waste your time, Dad. I'd responded with a thumbs-up emoji, swallowing my disappointment like I always did. My phone vibrated in my pocket. Jillian calling. I declined it without a second thought, a small act of rebellion that felt strangely liberating. Instead, I took a photo of the moonlit caldera and sent it to our family chat with a brief message. Arrived in Santorini. Will return a few days before the wedding. I downed the champagne in one long swallow, feeling the bubbles burn their way down my throat. Wandering back inside, I explored my temporary home. The villa was a study in contrasts. Ancient stone walls housing modern luxuries, traditional Greek textiles alongside sleek technology. In the bedroom, a book lay on the pillow, The Odyssey in English translation. Another small irony. Odysseus spent 10 years trying to return home. I'd spent 20 years at home, feeling increasingly lost. I opened the balcony doors in the bedroom, letting the night air flood in. From somewhere down the hillside, I could hear faint music, bouzouki strings and a man's voice singing in Greek. The melody carried emotions I couldn't understand in words but felt in my bones. Longing, perhaps, or remembrance. Exhaustion suddenly hit me like a physical wave. I hadn't slept properly since Jillian's casual announcement about the wedding. I collapsed onto the bed fully clothed, the cool sheets a relief against my travel-weary skin. As consciousness began to fade, my phone buzzed again, a text from Jillian. Where exactly are you staying? When will you be back? Camille is upset. I turned the phone face down without replying. For 20 years, I'd been instantly available, reliable Michael, answering every call, solving every problem. Tonight, I would be someone else, just a man on an island answering to no one. The last thing I remember before sleep claimed me was the distant sound of waves crashing against volcanic rock far below. Nature's timeless rhythm continuing regardless of human dramas. There was something comforting in that indifference, in being so small against the backdrop of geological time. For the first time in years, I fell asleep without worrying about tomorrow. 10 days had passed in a blissful blur of sun, sea, and blessed anonymity. I'd fallen into an easy rhythm. Mornings spent reading on my private terrace, afternoons exploring the island's hidden corners, evenings savoring local wines as the sunset painted the white buildings in shades of gold and pink. This morning, I joined other guests at the communal breakfast table on the main terrace. I'd come to enjoy these casual encounters with strangers who knew nothing of my history. 67 years together next month, John was saying, his weathered hand covering his wife Maria's. They were retired teachers from Australia, celebrating their 40th wedding anniversary with a Mediterranean cruise. I watched their easy intimacy, the way they anticipated each other's needs, finishing sentences and passing sugar without asking. That's quite an achievement, I said, unable to imagine what 40 years with Jillian might have looked like. We'd barely made it to 20 with our souls intact. The secret is listening, Maria said, her eyes twinkling. Even when you think you've heard it all before. Beside me, Sophia, a young artist who spent her days capturing Santorini's landscapes on canvas, nudged a small watercolor sketch toward me. It showed the caldera at sunrise, the colors vibrant despite their simplicity. For you, she said. You look like someone who needs color in his life. I accepted it with genuine gratitude, touched by this unexpected kindness from a woman 50 years my junior who somehow saw through my carefully constructed vacation persona. After breakfast, I retreated to the infinity pool with a copy of The Odyssey I'd been slowly working through. The ancient tale of a man trying to find his way home felt both ironic and fitting. Though unlike Odysseus, I wasn't sure I wanted to return to my Penelope. I ordered a beer despite the early hour, silently justifying it with the thought, I'm not living by anyone's rules here. The first sip was cold and sharp on my tongue when my phone, which I'd placed face down on the table, suddenly erupted into a frenzy of vibrations. For days I'd kept it mostly off, checking occasionally for emergencies but otherwise enjoying the digital detox. Reluctantly, I turned it over to find a barrage of notifications cascading across the screen. Theo, call me immediately. Wedding cancelled. Huge scandal. 5 missed calls from Jillian. Camille, Dad? Where are you? I need my dad. And most surprisingly from Bryce's mother, Michael, this is Susan. The situation has spiraled out of control. I apologize for insisting on your absence. Camille needs you. I stared at the screen in disbelief. The wedding was supposed to be a week away, yet according to Theo, it was already cancelled? Bad news from home? Andreas, the local fisherman who supplied the villa's fresh seafood and occasionally joined guests for breakfast, had approached quietly. He stood now at the edge of the pool, his skin tanned to leather from decades under the Grecian sun. Seems like a catastrophe, I replied, still scrolling through the increasingly frantic messages. With a shaking hand, I called Theo, my wife's cousin and the only family member I genuinely liked. He answered on the first ring. Finally. Do you know everyone's looking for you? I got the messages, I said, walking away from the pool for privacy. What happened? The wedding's still a week away. Theo's deep sigh carried across thousands of miles. They moved it up to last weekend. Susan found a cheaper venue option. Nobody thought to tell you? The words hit me like a physical blow. They, what? Moved the wedding up. Last weekend. Please tell me you knew. Andreas approached with a guitar in hand, misreading my shocked expression. Music heals the soul better than alcohol, my friend. He offered the instrument with a gentle smile. I accepted it mechanically, my mind still processing Theo's words. The wedding had already happened, or rather, had been supposed to happen, and nobody had bothered to inform me of the date change. My fingers found the strings, automatically playing the melody I'd composed for Camille's 6th birthday, the notes rising into the clear Santorini air as Theo continued explaining the disaster I'd fortuitously missed. In my bag, my phone continued to vibrate with incoming calls, but the guitar's music drowned out the sound. For a moment, I was transported back to Camille's childhood bedroom, playing this same tune while she drifted to sleep, her small hand clutching my finger as if afraid I might disappear. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd spent years afraid of being forgotten, and now, when I'd finally stepped away, they couldn't forget me fast enough. So what happens now? I asked Theo, the final notes of Camille's lullaby fading into the Mediterranean breeze. That depends, he replied. Are you coming home to clean up their mess, or have you finally learned what I've been telling you for years? I looked out over the endless blue horizon, the question hanging between us as heavy as the midday sun. The guitar felt more real in my hands than anything in my life back home. I'll call you back, I said and ended the call. Evening had settled over Santorini, transforming the whitewashed buildings into ghostly silhouettes against the deepening blue sky. I sat on my balcony, a glass of local wine untouched beside me as I tried to process the day's revelations. The wedding date had been changed without my knowledge. My daughter had gotten married, or attempted to, while I lounged by a pool an ocean away. I felt a peculiar mix of guilt and vindication, the latter making me more uncomfortable than the former. Jillian's words from that fateful afternoon echoed, less awkward. Perhaps my absence had indeed made things less awkward, until whatever catastrophe Theo had alluded to unfolded. With a deep breath, I dialed Theo's number again, ready for the full story. Tell me everything, I said when he answered, no preamble necessary. Theo's laugh was humorless. You want the comedy version or the tragedy? The truth. Okay, picture this, he began, his voice taking on the theatrical tone he used when telling stories at family gatherings. Susan, that witch of a mother-in-law, convinced everyone to move the wedding up a week because she found a bargain deal at the reception venue. And Jillian agreed to this? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Eagerly. Anything to please the almighty Susan. The problem was, nobody bothered to tell the father of the bride about the date change. I felt my jaw tighten. Go on. During the rehearsal dinner, Camille asked where you were. Jillian said you couldn't make it. Oh, and here's the kicker, she told everyone you were in the hospital with appendicitis. She what? The lie was so specific, so unnecessary that it left me momentarily speechless. Exactly. So at the actual wedding, or what was supposed to be the wedding, Bryce found messages on Camille's phone from her ex, David. You remember him? The one she dated for 5 years before Bryce. I nodded, though Theo couldn't see me. David had been a decent guy, quiet, thoughtful, perhaps a bit too serious for Camille at the time. The messages were sent at 2 in the morning before the wedding, It's not too late to change your mind. I closed my eyes, already seeing where this was heading. Bryce lost it, Theo continued, warming to his tale. Interrupted Jillian's toast, which was all about family unity, by the way, the irony, and accused Camille of cheating in front of 80 guests. Jesus, I muttered. That's not even the best part. Susan stands up and announces, I always knew this girl wasn't good enough for my son. Then Jillian throws a glass of champagne at Susan, ruining her $1,000 mother of the groom dress. Despite everything, I couldn't suppress a smile at the image of proper, controlled Jillian losing her composure so spectacularly. Colin tried to defuse the situation, Theo went on, referring to Jillian's brother, but he tripped over the DJ's wires and killed the music just as Bryce was storming out. And Camille? I asked, concerned despite my detachment. Theo's voice sobered. That's the part that might actually get to you, Mike. She stood there in her dress, crying, saying over and over, "Where's my dad? I need my dad." I felt something crack inside me, an icy shell I'd been carefully constructing over the past 10 days. You know what's really funny? Theo added. Jillian told everyone you were in the hospital. When Rosa mentioned you were actually in Santorini, it started a whole second war. Jillian's face turned this fascinating shade of purple. What happened to Camille after that? Theo's sigh carried the weight of genuine concern. Locked herself in the hotel room. The minibar bill is probably more than the wedding at this point. After thanking him for the information, I ended the call, feeling a strange mixture of emotions I couldn't quite name. Part of me felt a petty satisfaction that the perfectly orchestrated event had imploded so spectacularly. The other part, the father in me, ached for Camille despite her role in excluding me. Instead of calling my family immediately as they clearly expected, I took a drive around the island. The evening air was cool against my face as I navigated the winding roads, eventually stopping at the archaeological site of Akrotiri, a Bronze Age settlement buried under volcanic ash. I walked among the ancient ruins, oddly comforted by these remnants of a civilization obliterated in a single cataclysmic moment. There was something poetic about it, a city preserved precisely because it had been destroyed, much like how my departure had finally made my family acknowledge my existence. I found Sophia there, capturing the ruins in soft watercolors as the setting sun cast long shadows across the excavated streets. Some things have to be destroyed before we can see their true value, she said without looking up from her canvas, as if reading my thoughts. I stood beside her in silence, watching as her brush transformed destruction into something hauntingly beautiful. I returned to Villa Aphrodite as darkness settled over the island, the distant lights of cruise ships twinkling like earthbound stars on the horizon. Physical exhaustion from the day's explorations had done nothing to quiet my mind, which continued to replay Theo's words, "Where's my dad? I need my dad." After 20 years of showing up, at dance recitals, soccer games, parent-teacher conferences, family dinners where I was treated like furniture, the one time Camille truly needed me, I was halfway across the world, drinking wine on a terrace. Uncorking a bottle of local wine, I carried it to the balcony and settled into a chair facing the caldera. The moon traced a silver path across the dark water, inviting contemplation. I'd been avoiding the inevitable long enough. I pulled out my phone and finally braced myself to listen to the voice messages that had accumulated like emotional landmines. Jillian's voice came first, high-pitched and frantic. "Michael, where the hell are you? Everything is falling apart. If you were just here like a father is supposed to be." The accusation stung despite its absurdity. I'd always been there, until they'd made it clear my presence wasn't wanted. Next came Camille, her voice thick with tears. "Dad, I've ruined everything. I shouldn't have listened to Mom and Susan about changing the date. I let them convince me you wouldn't care anyway." I closed my eyes, feeling the ache of that revelation. They'd actually discussed me, decided on my behalf that I wouldn't care anyway, about my only daughter's wedding date. Colin's message was predictably inappropriate. "Hey buddy. You missed the best show ever. Your wife threw cake at the mother-in-law. Legendary stuff." I could picture him, already half drunk at what was supposed to be a solemn occasion, finding entertainment in the family's public disintegration. Noelle, my oldest friend, always the voice of reason. "Michael, this is your chance to step up and show who's the head of the family. Come back and fix this mess." I snorted softly. Head of the family? I'd been demoted to background character years ago, expected to provide financial stability while having no say in decisions. Then, unexpectedly, Jillian's mother, "I always said my daughter made a mistake marrying you. Now you're proving me right, hiding on some island." The vitriol in Ellis's voice was nothing new. She'd never approved of me, always finding ways to undermine our relationship with her passive-aggressive comments. Most surprising was a message from Susan herself. "Michael, I apologize for insisting on your absence. I thought it would be better for Bryce, but now I see I was mistaken." The humility in her voice seemed genuine, though it came far too late to mean anything. A final message caught me off guard, from David at work. "Heard about the wedding fiasco. Beers on me when you get back." Word had spread beyond family then. I wondered what version of events was circulating through our social circles. A soft knock interrupted my thoughts. Eleni stood at the door, her professional smile tinged with awkwardness. "I'm sorry to disturb you, but your wife has called the front desk 3 times. She says it's an emergency." I handed her a generous tip. "Tell her I'm fine but unavailable." Eleni's smile shifted to one of understanding. "My grandmother always said, sometimes you must step away to see the whole picture." Her wisdom delivered, she retreated, leaving me to my thoughts and the distant sound of waves breaking against volcanic shores. With a deep breath, I dialed Camille's voicemail, not ready for a direct conversation but needing to acknowledge her pain. "I'm okay," I said after the beep. "I need time. I didn't know about the date change." That says a lot. Brief, perhaps too cryptic, but it was all I could manage without my voice betraying emotions I wasn't ready to process. I scrolled through old photos on my phone. Camille at her high school graduation, my face beaming with pride beside her. Jillian and me on our wedding day, young and full of certainty about our future. My last birthday, blowing out candles alone while the others checked their phones, the cake a store-bought afterthought. The progression told its own story, one of gradual erasure, of becoming peripheral in my own narrative. I covered my face with my hands but found no tears came. They dried up years ago in the desert of neglect my marriage had become. A text from Rosa broke the silence. "They're all freaking out. Jillian's talking about flying to Greece. You okay, brother?" I typed back, "Better than I've been in years." Let them freak out. It was petty, perhaps, but after a decade of shrinking myself to accommodate their expectations and needs, there was something liberating about standing firm in my absence. The wine bottle was half empty now, much like my marriage. But unlike the wine, which grew more bitter with exposure to air, I found myself expanding into something almost resembling peace. Tomorrow I decided I would visit that black sand beach Andreas had mentioned. "A place where dark thoughts are washed away by darker sand," he'd said. Tonight, though, I would sit with these revelations, letting them settle into my bones like new truths I could finally acknowledge. Day 12. The sun hung low over Santorini as I settled at a taverna right on the beach, my feet nearly touching the sand. The place was modest, plastic chairs, paper tablecloths, strings of lights swaying in the gentle breeze, but it exuded an authenticity missing from the tourist traps closer to Oahe. Nikos, the barrel-chested owner, approached with a platter that threatened to collapse under its bounty of seafood. "Special for the lonely American with sad eyes," he announced, setting it down with a theatrical flourish. "Best seafood on island, octopus, shrimp, fish caught this morning." "Who says I'm sad?" I challenged, surveying the impressive spread. "I'm on the most beautiful island in the world." Nikos winked as he poured wine without waiting for my order. "Eyes never lie, friend. But sea cures all wounds." He patted my shoulder with a hand rough from decades of pulling nets. My phone vibrated against the wooden table. Rosa's name appeared on the screen. I almost declined, as had become my habit, but something, perhaps Nikos's assessment of my sad eyes, made me answer. "Brother, you picked the perfect time to disappear." Rosa's voice erupted through the speaker, vibrant and unfiltered as always. "Is that a compliment or criticism?" I asked, unable to suppress a smile. Of all my in-laws, Rosa had always been the only one I genuinely enjoyed, blunt, loyal, and refreshingly immune to family politics. "Both?" she laughed. "You should have seen Jillian telling everyone you were in the hospital with appendicitis. Imagine my face when I saw your Santorini photo pop up in the family chat." I closed my eyes, picturing the scene. "Tell me everything. The unedited version." And she did. Rosa had never been one to soften truths. Camille didn't even know they'd changed the wedding date until it was too late. That was pure Susan and Jillian. They sold it to her as a logistics decision, whatever that means. After the blow-up with the ex-boyfriend's messages, Camille ran out in tears. Bryce was shouting, "You never really wanted to marry me anyway." Jillian was running around like a headless chicken trying to calm the guests, but making everything worse. She kept saying, "Michael would know what to do. Michael always fixes everything." That old witch Ellis announced to everyone within earshot, My daughter married an irresponsible man, so naturally her daughter isn't much better. Colin tried to save the situation with a toast that nobody wanted, then knocked over the gift table. 3 crystal vases didn't survive. Rosa's laughter bubbled through the phone, but then her voice took on a more serious tone. You know what Camille told me yesterday? I thought Dad would always be there no matter how far I pushed him away. I was wrong. A wave crashed against the shore, echoing the impact of those words. She actually said that? I asked, gripping my wine glass tighter. Word for word. She also said she let her mom and Susan convince her that you weren't interested in the wedding, which is why she didn't insist on inviting you or tell you about the date change. I absorbed this in silence, watching a young couple stroll along the water's edge, their fingers interlaced, their future still unwritten. Michael, this might be the best lesson you could have given her, that love has limits. Nikos returned with dessert, baklava dripping with honey. For the heart, he explained with a solemn nod. I didn't want this to happen, I confessed to Rosa after Nikos departed. I just wanted to exist in their eyes. Sometimes people need to lose you to understand you were there, Rosa replied with rare wisdom. So what now, brother? Bringing back some Santorini magic to fix everything? I watched an elderly Greek couple at a nearby table, feeding each other bites of food with the comfortable intimacy of decades. I don't think everything can be fixed. Or should be. That might be the first smart thing you've said in 20 years of marriage, Rosa said. Jillian's organizing a search party, you know. She's convinced you're having some kind of breakdown. The breakdown happened years ago, I replied. This is the recovery. After we hung up, I remained at the taverna as night fully descended and other patrons gradually departed. Nikos eventually joined me, bringing a bottle of ouzo and 2 small glasses. In Greece we don't drink alone, he explained, pouring the anise-scented liquor. Bad for soul. Under a canopy of stars more brilliant than any I'd seen at home, Nikos shared tales of the island, of fishermen lost at sea and found again, of lovers separated by fate and reunited by persistence, of the volcano that destroyed and created in the same breath. Life is circle, he said, tracing the rim of his glass. What breaks make space for new building. I nodded, understanding now why I'd been drawn to this particular island at this particular moment. Sometimes you need to see ancient ruins to recognize what you've been living in. Day 13 dawned with unexpected clarity, both in the sky and in my mind. I rose early, laced up the running shoes I'd barely used in years, and set out along the coastal path. The morning air carried the scent of salt, wild thyme, and possibility. My body protested at first, muscles remembering the comfort of my office chair rather than the exertion of a proper run. But with each step, each controlled breath, I felt something unraveling inside me, knots of resentment and grief loosening with the rhythm of my feet against the earth. American. You run like you're chasing something. The voice belonged to Andreas, who was securing his small fishing boat at a tiny dock. He waved me over, his weathered face creasing with a smile. Or running away, perhaps? I slowed to a stop, wiping sweat from my forehead. Maybe a bit of both. Andreas gestured to his boat. Come. Fish don't catch themselves and men don't solve problems on land. 20 minutes later, we were cutting through the crystalline waters of the Aegean, the island receding behind us like my former life. Andreas handed me a simple fishing rod and demonstrated the technique with the easy confidence of a man who'd been doing this since childhood. My wife left me 10 years ago, he said without preamble as we sat watching our lines disappear into the blue depths. With a tourist from Germany. Younger, richer, with soft hands unlike these. He held up his calloused palms. I murmured something sympathetic, but he waved it away. At first I wanted revenge. Thought about following them to Germany, making a scene. He reeled in his line, checked the bait, and cast again with practiced precision. But then I realized, if someone can leave, you must let them go. The simplicity of his philosophy struck me. Just like that. Not just. It took 2 years of drinking too much ouzo and shouting at the sea. Andreas grinned ruefully. But one morning I woke up and understood, you cannot force someone to see your value. So I built a life where I could see it myself. Something tugged at my line, and Andreas guided me through reeling in a modest silver fish that glinted like quicksilver in the morning light. As we secured it in a bucket of seawater, I found myself sharing my own story. How I'd gradually become invisible in my own home. How Jillian only seemed to notice me when she needed something fixed, paid, or managed. How Camille had outgrown her old-fashioned father, and relegated me to an ATM and occasional moving service. How I'd swallowed my opinions and desires for years, afraid that speaking up would shatter our fragile family balance. Andreas listened without interruption, nodding occasionally as if my story were one he'd heard many times before, perhaps because pain, like the sea, follows universal patterns. "Such a life is not for a man, brother," he finally said, squinting toward the horizon. "Better alone in a boat than a ghost in your own house." When we returned to shore, the sun was high, and my phone showed a new email from Jillian. "You've made your point. Come home so we can talk this through." Her tone, impatient, dismissive, as if I were a child throwing a tantrum, ignited a spark of anger I'd suppressed for too long. I typed a response, deleted it, typed again, and finally sent. "Extending my stay another week. Don't wait up." Then a message from Camille. "Dad, I'm so sorry. This isn't how it was supposed to be. I let Mom and Bryce's family pressure me. I was stupid. Please call." I forwarded this to Rosa with a single question. "Genuine?" Her response came immediately, 50-50. "She's sorry, but she also wants you to come back and fix her mistakes." As usual. Standing in the town square, I impulsively purchased a bouquet of local flowers from a small shop and carried them to the tiny white church perched on the hillside above the village. Inside, the air was cool and heavy with centuries of prayers and incense. I placed the flowers before an icon and whispered, "For all the promises I kept, and those I can no longer hold." An elderly woman in black, kneeling nearby, looked up. "God understands when a heart is broken," she said in Greek-accented English. "I'm not sure my family does," I replied, watching sunlight filter through the small windows to create patterns on the stone floor. "Then perhaps it is time for a new family." She gestured toward the sea and sky visible through the open door, the endless blue expanse suggesting infinite possibilities. Walking back down the hill, I felt lighter than I had in years, as if I'd set down a burden I hadn't fully acknowledged carrying. My phone buzzed with yet another message from Jillian, but for once I didn't feel the compulsive need to respond immediately. Instead, I took a detour to the beach, removed my shoes, and waded into the shallows. The water was cold against my feet, but the sun warm on my face, contradictions coexisting peacefully, much like the grief and liberation now coursing through me in equal measure. I woke on the 14th day with a lightness I hadn't experienced in decades. The weight of expectations, both those placed upon me and those I'd placed upon myself, had gradually lifted during my time on this volcanic island. Perhaps Nikos was right about the sea curing all wounds. Over breakfast, I decided to visit the black sand beach Andreas had mentioned. "A place where dark thoughts are washed away by black sand," he'd said with the cryptic smile of a man who had found his peace through loss. I tucked my still unread copy of the Odyssey into my bag. 14 days on the island, and I'd carried Homer's epic everywhere without reading a single page. Maybe today was the day Odysseus would finally speak to me. The beach was nearly deserted when I arrived, a crescent of midnight black sand embraced by towering cliffs, the water impossibly blue against the dark shore. Only a few locals and a solitary woman reading beneath a wide-brimmed hat occupied the vast expanse. I spread my towel, set down my book, and strode directly into the sea. The cold water shocked my system, but I pushed forward, diving beneath the surface until the world above disappeared. I swam until my muscles burned, each stroke carrying me farther from the man who had arrived on this island 2 weeks ago, the invisible man, the convenient man, the man who had allowed himself to fade into the background of his own life. When I finally returned to shore, breathless and invigorated, I heard a voice. "You seem to have found real freedom out there in the waves." The woman with the book had lowered her sunglasses to address me, her accent softly Italian, her smile genuine. Silver-streaked dark hair framed a face that had known both joy and sorrow, the most interesting kind of face. "I'm Serena," she said, extending her hand. "Professor of literature from Florence, widow and accidental tourist who stayed too long." "Michael," I replied, accepting her handshake. "Accountant from Boston, still legally married and intentional escapee." She laughed, a warm sound that seemed to belong perfectly to this beach. "What are you reading?" she asked, nodding toward my untouched book. I held up the Odyssey, slightly embarrassed. "Aspirational reading, I'm afraid. I haven't actually opened it." Serena showed me her own book, 100 Years of Solitude. "Both about returning home," she observed with a small smile. "But what if home no longer exists?" Her simple question cut through to something essential I hadn't articulated even to myself. What was I returning to? An empty house? A marriage that existed only on paper? A daughter who remembered my value only in my absence? We spent the afternoon talking as if we'd known each other for years. The ease of conversation with a stranger who expected nothing from me was intoxicating. We discovered unexpected commonalities. A shared love for box cello suites. Children who had built lives that didn't include us. The experience of feeling invisible in our own relationships. My husband died 5 years ago, Serena said, tracing patterns in the black sand. But truthfully, I lost him long before that, to his work, his books, his world that had no place for me. I nodded, understanding completely. What did you do afterward? I taught myself to exist without being needed. Her eyes met mine. It's harder than it sounds. When the sun began its descent, we decided to continue our conversation over dinner. The taverna was small, family-owned, tucked into a side street away from tourist paths. Over grilled fish and white wine, Serena asked the question no one else had dared. Will you go back to them? I sat with the question, feeling its weight. The automatic, of course, that would have been my response 2 weeks ago no longer came so easily. I'll go back to the house, I finally said. But to that life? No. Serena reached across the table and took my hand. Sometimes the bravest act is finally choosing yourself. Later we walked barefoot along the shoreline, our shoes dangling from our fingers, the day's heat radiating from the sand while the water cooled our feet. We stood side by side in the shallow waves, watching the sunset paint the caldera in shades of gold and crimson. Like life, Serena said, wiggling her toes in the wet sand. Warm and cold moments right next to each other. I took a photo of our shadows stretching across the beach and posted it with the caption, "New beginnings come unexpectedly." For the first time, I didn't think about whether Jillian or Camille would see it. As the stars began to appear, we exchanged contact information without promises but with open possibilities. There was something wonderfully honest about this connection. Two people with no illusions, no desperate need to fill the empty spaces in their lives, just a genuine appreciation for finding understanding in an unexpected place. Walking back to my villa alone, I realized I'd left the Odyssey on the beach, forgotten in the tide of conversation. It seemed fitting somehow. I was no longer a man trying to find his way back to a home that might not exist. I was someone charting a new course entirely. My last day on Santorini dawned with the kind of perfect clarity that seemed designed for epiphanies. I rose with the sun, determined to make one final pilgrimage to the highest point of the island before my afternoon flight. The path wound steeply upward, each turn revealing more breathtaking views of the caldera below. As I climbed, I encountered each person who had shaped my time here. Nikos appeared first, carrying supplies to his taverna. He pressed a small package into my hands. "To remember us," he said. Inside were herbs and spices from his kitchen. Oregano, thyme, and saffron threads precious as gold. Further along, Andreas waited by a curve in the road as if he'd known I would pass. He handed me a small wooden boat he'd carved himself. "So you don't forget you can always sail away," he said with a wink. Near the summit, Sophia sat with her easel, capturing the morning light on canvas. She presented me with a painting of my silhouette against the sea. "You are no longer invisible," she said simply. At the highest point, I stood among ancient stones and called Camille. She answered immediately as if she'd been waiting by the phone. "Dad." Her voice was smaller than I remembered, stripped of its usual confidence. "It's me," I confirmed, watching a ferry cut a white path through the blue waters below. "You just disappeared. Without a word. I didn't know you felt that way." "How could you not know?" I asked, genuine curiosity replacing the anger I'd expected to feel. "I've been invisible for years." "I thought you'd always be there," she said, her voice breaking. "It was selfish. I let the silence stretch between us, across oceans and continents." "Everyone has a breaking point, Camille," I finally said. "Mine was becoming an unwelcome guest at my daughter's wedding, then not even being told about the date change. I let Mom and Susan make all the decisions," she admitted. "When they suggested moving the date earlier, I went along without thinking about you. Mom said she'd tell you. And you believed her?" I couldn't keep the shock from my voice. "After everything?" A long pause followed. "Yes, because it was easier to believe than to check. Because you were always just there. Like air. People only notice air when it's gone," I said. "Now you've noticed." "Bryce is gone," she said abruptly. "He says he can't trust me. But the truth is I wasn't sure myself. I wanted you there to tell me everything would be okay." "I would have told you the truth if you'd asked," I replied. "That's probably why I wasn't invited." When we ended the call, I felt neither vindication nor sorrow, just clarity. Some bridges couldn't be rebuilt exactly as they were before. Sometimes the collapse created an opportunity for better architecture. Before boarding my flight, I received a message from Serena. Odysseus took 10 years to return home. But you're not Odysseus. You're Phoenix. The reference made me smile. Not a man trying to reclaim his past, but one reborn from its ashes. I arrived home late in the evening to an empty house. No lights welcomed me, no pretense of normalcy awaited. Jillian's closet stood open and half empty. A note lay on the kitchen counter, the same spot where I'd left my own message 2 weeks ago. Staying at Mom's. Need space to think. Call when you're ready to talk sensibly. I laughed, crumpled the note into a ball and tossed it into the trash. The symmetry was perfect. She was now the one seeking space while I had become solid and present. The next morning I began my own reconstruction. I donated my wedding suit to a charity shop, watching as they hung it on a rack for someone else's beginning. I registered for a hiking group I'd been eyeing for years but had never joined because Jillian called it a waste of weekends. I signed up for guitar lessons, a college dream abandoned in the name of practicality and paychecks. I called Rosa and invited her to lunch. Time to rebuild the connections that actually matter, I explained. When Jillian finally texted, Camille wants to see you. When will you end this childish disappearing act? I replied with newfound clarity. Tell her my address hasn't changed. My door is open. But I'm no longer the man who waits for an invitation to participate in his own life. Instead of preparing dinner for an empty house, I took my newly purchased guitar onto the back porch. The melody I'd composed for Camille's childhood lullaby came back surprisingly easily, muscle memory outlasting even the most determined forgetting. My phone rang, Serena calling from Santorini, where she'd decided to stay another month. How does freedom feel? She asked. Terrifying, I admitted. Exhilarating. The best things usually are both. As the sunset painted the sky in colors that couldn't match Santorini but held their own beauty, I strummed the old lullaby and contemplated the strange alchemy of loss. Sometimes what breaks apart reveals what matters. Sometimes what ends makes space for beginning. I was no longer Michael the Invisible. I was simply Michael, finally seen, not through others' eyes but through my own.